Following the end of the Second War and the election victory of Margaret Thatcher in 1979, Britain is said to be in an age of consensus. This means that the two parties believe in the same thing: mixed economy, Keynesian economics, a strong welfare state, and dealing with other contemporary issues such as decolonisation and troubles in Northern Ireland. There are always those who wish to break this consensus, on both the right and the left, from a number of issues, from immigration to changing the way we managed our economy. Parties were liable to have large internal battles over these sorts of issues. This is why British political scene in the spirit isn't calm as it first appears, and we have the formation of groups as the CND and the National Front.
The consensus period of British politics is often considered from Attlee's victory in 1945 to Margaret Thatcher's walking into Downing Street in 1979. But I have chosen the period 1951 as a starting point because we have a Conservative government implementing many of Labour's goals of creating this new Jerusalem. And it's also a remarkable idea how the Conservative Party has transformed from this right-wing party of the 1930s to a much more moderate version of itself, and how these sort of goals and ideas are shared across both parties in the period. I'm currently at Warwick University, a product of this age of consensus, and if you look at this period from 1960 to 1950, it's an optimistic age, a meritocratic age, where people believe they can do, yet by 1974 this dream is dying. And we can say that although consensus looks strong, it is built on weak foundations. And we can see this by each party having these fundamental shifts that leave their bases weakened. For example, Richard Crossan's writes to Herbert Morrison, saying that in 1951 that the party is being overtaken by communists in its grassroots. And even though these shifts look fundamental, how fundamental can we say they are? For example, Churchill in 1945 said that NHS and a welfare state, he would need a Gestapo of some sort. Yet he is still continuing these policies of welfare state, NHS, strong education, when he gets elected in 1951. So how strong can consensus be? And was this why he died in 1974?
You'll find it in the city of Coventry. Not only does it, in its planning, try and suggest a modern and vibrant city ready for the 20th century, but also what values the government has. This means good housing based upon tower blocks seen across the UK and Europe, a welfare state for workers, and jobs in heavy industry. This is the Britain that millions of people knew about and fought for. This was their dream. Consensus within the 1950s can be shown by general conformity and loathing of those who tried to break it, or even those who tried to redefine the mould, whether that was unmarried mothers, teddy boys, to the beginning of a multiracial society. Britain was trying to change, and consensus was the only way that people thought that they could do it. Yet, the people of Britain wasn't sure what it was. If we were looking at the way Britain embraced change within society, we see it's a slow and steady process. And there was a sense of uncertainty. British politicians, on the whole, wanted to be elected, so consensus wasn't ideological, it was pragmatic. Even though countries like France and Germany began to pull away from us, and we lagged behind them due to our policies.
Throughout the period, both parties agreed on large-scale controversial issues, from anywhere in the 50s with the Suez Crisis, to the Malay emergency, to even more long-term issues such as Northern Ireland. We see that both parties are willing to back each other, as they know they have to. And we can see consensus in the elections itself. For example, Lord Hailsham says, "I would appeal to all parties in positions of authority and responsibility. Politics in this age was all things to all people, and had been nicknamed Buttscalism after Labour and Conservative politics being so similar that they could just be written off as the same thing altogether. What we also see is an inability to actually change the system, even if they oppose it. For example, even when Labour creates a comprehensive system, the Conservative Party goes along with it, even though they opposed it. And it was one of those ironies of history that Margaret Thatcher, a Conservative education minister, shut more grammar schools than the Labour Party did. And we show the change is sporadic, and when it does happen, there is no clear reason. And consensus was built on stability and trying to have that home and abroad. For example, decolonisation within the colonies was quick and relatively stable for such a massive undertaking when compared to other colonies such as the Portuguese ones or the French. This shows that Britain's goal was to try and create a stable society for its people, and this meant having to go into new and unknown realms, whether that was Europe or going into this special relationship. And we also see how parties are unwilling to face up to the realities of the situation, whether that was sending troops to Northern Ireland for stability purposes, yet it was this was a short-sighted measure, and short-sightedness was the underkey of all consensus politics, short-term rather than ignoring the long-term.
The term Buttscallism was a contemporary term in the 1950s, and so on, for what became known as consensus. It was an amalgamation of two senior politicians' names, that of Conservative Rab Butler and the Labour leader Hugh Gaitskell. Both are some of the classic what-if prime ministers, and if we have a look at them, see is the similarities in both the Conservative and Labour Party. Both came from the upper echelons of society, therefore had limited experience of ordinary people, and we see the actions of the welfare state as a short-term policy to keep ordinary people happy, rather than permanently transforming society to make people get what they need and want, rather than to forcing them to live a hand-to-mouth existence. What we see is this consensus politics which is pragmatic, and it's also the same elites dominating it there, with respective tokens for ordinary class people and other groups such as women. Consensus politics was indeed all about maintaining Britain and its status quo, and any rocking of the boat risks causing truly transformational change was ignored, such as creating a fully meritocratic system. What transformation in society we saw was from the bottom up, not top down, whether this was the creation of youth culture, the creation of the teenager, for example, or the creation of multicultural society shown through immigration and transformation of social attitudes. The golden age of capitalism was an age in which the elite remained elites and ordinary people remained at the bottom of society. Buttscallism shows a sense that nothing ever changes, and if there is change, it's with an ulterior motive. And we can see that in the present day, with Blatchcalism, the neoliberal consensus of Blair and Thatcher, consensus politics existed as for the elites to dominate both parties and limit what they felt was dangerous and risky. For those that did not want to break away from consensus, it was down to ideological reasons. Take two figures who represent an attempt to break away within their respective movements. Enoch Powell and his ideology, Powellism, is simply a forerunner to Thatcherism. The fact that he spoke out against immigration and therefore against consensus and was in due course kicked out into the wilderness shows the risks against going against the mainstream. The fact, however, much of his ideas defined post-1979 world indicates that his ideas resonated with people, and not all people accepted this new Britain. The large scale of support for Powell reflects a large sense of separation between the government and its people across this period. For all the more cons and culture, change the life of them hadn't really happened, and so Powell's anti-immigration pro-British message appealed to people. Mr. Thatcher simply presented it better. On the other hand, many in the left felt that governments, both Labour and Conservative, weren't doing enough, and that Labour seemed to have adopted a policy of McDonaldism without McDonald. We can see this by Anthony Crosland, who wrote productively during this period and wanted to create a fundamental change in society, and felt that Labour leaders ignored the real issues. The fact that Crosland is well remembered by the post-consensus Labour Party suggests how his views have been taken on and how they've impacted future generations. These men's views, both Powell and Crosland, were shaped by the period, and they spoke them not to win power, but to highlight the need for change that they deeply believed should happen to a society. The reason for the decline of consensus is not clear, but simply, in the eyes of some, it wasn't working. By the late 60s and early 70s, Britain had employment over 1 million, a figure which, until recently, was unthinkable, and also the dreaded stagflation. The only solution seemed to be radical measures. Ill at ease with consensus, known since the war. Attempts by both parties failed, whether this was Labour's in place of strife, or Edward Heath's free market reforms. All were shot down by the constant figure in the period, the trade unions. Yet even the trade unions, it seems, were divided, and lacked a clear direction. For example, there was division as to whether the Association of Scientific and Technical and Managerial Staffs would be able to take industrial action in 1969 in Coventry, and there seemed large-scale disagreements between the management and ordinary members. The fact that not even trade unions were unified suggests that consensus is an overused term, and it's only post-1979 that we see consensus as being apparent. Consensus politics exists in certain areas still today. For example, when consensus ends, only Keynesianism died away. Beveragism still exists. For Thatcher's longing, Britain never truly got rid of its NHS or its welfare state. This is a constant in the age of consensus, and whenever there was a reform or attempted reform, it focused on the economic aspect, not welfare.
Whether this was the planned robot reforms of the 50s, or the free market reforms of Heath in the 1970s, this indicated that consensus was never truly there in economics, as there was always a desire to tinker with it and create something fundamentally new rather than sticking with Keynesian orthodoxy. Although the issues rarely changed between 1951 and 1974, there was little change on the political landscape as well, and we still see an Oxbridge elite dominating politics both in the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. And even though we move away from the Etonian educated Macmillan with his clipped vowels to the broad Yorkshire accent of Harold Wilson, Britain as a society dominated by elites never fundamentally goes away. Its elites simply get renamed. Yet the system remained the same, and this is why they remained the same. We weren't willing to fully embrace a meritocratic government, and as time progressed, this halted consensus, and was a reason for the deep unrest within society as a whole.
Go.
In conclusion, there was consensus politics between the years 1951 and 74, yet it was not as universally popular as it appears on the surface, and for the reasons of longevity, there was a lack of willingness to rock the boat. Britain was deeply divided as a country and as a nation, and by 1974 consensus politics is all but over, as both from the left and the right it being an attack and fundamentally ending in 1979, and which is not a huge surprise as its foundations were weak and unstable. Yet it had a lasting legacy, as we now have a NHS which is strong, stable, and it seems to be deeply rooted in our culture to have a welfare state. Keynes may have died in 1974, but the ideas of a new Jerusalem and the Beveridge Report never truly went away.